This video was requested by a patron. See how you can request future video topics by becoming a patron today. And now, on with our feature presentation. October 7th, 1990. It's week 5 of the NFL season, and we've got a Sunday Night Football game on our hands on national TV on TNT between the Buffalo Bills and the Los Angeles Raiders, in what would eventually be a preview of that year's AFC Championship. Now, for the purposes of this story, the actual game itself does not matter, although the Bills erased a 10-point deficit and scored the final 24 points of the game to win it 38-24, thanks to an absolute onslaught of scoring in the fourth quarter. However, I bring this random Week 5 game up from the season before the subject of our story because prior to the game, Bills defensive line coach Chuck Dickerson had some incredibly pleasant and kind words to say about the head coach of the Raiders, Art Shell. When you've been around the game for as long as he's been around, and have been coaching for as long as he has, you know what good offensive play looks like. And Dickerson wouldn't dare disrespect a high-quality offensive line, or a high-quality offensive lineman. As he said on Shell, who am I to argue with a guy like Art Shell? He's one of the greatest blockers who ever played. Dickerson then added more praise on the Raiders, their coach, and their offensive line a few months later as they were getting ready for the AFC Championship, when he said, "You have to stop the running game, especially against the guys we're lining up against." Why do I bring these random quotes up from games against the Raiders? Because somewhere along the way, this guy right here, Chuck Dickerson, decided to do a complete 180 in his approach. Somewhere, Dickerson decided that heaping praise when being asked about a good offensive line and good offensive linemen, let alone one of the greatest offensive lines of all time, wasn't the right way of going about it. Somewhere, Dickerson decided that the best way to talk about the opposition was to deliver as much bulletin board material as possible, and to deliver trash talk like no one's business. And folks, I've covered tons of trash talk stories on this channel before, of times where a player or a coach decided that it was a good idea to talk trash, and it backfired in spectacular fashion. You can learn more about one of those stories by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But of all the instances of this happening, this might be the pinnacle. This might be the magnum opus of trash talk gone wrong. It's almost impossible to do worse than this, because not only did this backfire on the field, but it resulted in the man in question losing his job as a direct result of it. Because this is the story behind the controversy at Super Bowl XXVI, and what has to be, without a doubt, the worst trash talk of all time. January 5th, 1992, is the divisional round of the playoffs, and the Buffalo Bills are hosting the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, these teams met earlier in the season on Monday Night Football, and it was an absolute bloodbath, where the Chiefs won the game 33-6, as the Bills completely laid an egg. In that game, the Chiefs ran for 239 yards, with multiple players, Harvey Williams and Christian Okoye, eclipsing 100 yards, and Okoye scoring 2 touchdowns. The success of the ground game was a big reason why the Chiefs had the ball for over 44 minutes, controlling it for just under 75% of the game. But Buffalo's defensive line was not going to let that happen this time. No chance. Not after the speech that defensive line coach Chuck Dickerson gave his players before the game. Because as if the Bills' defensive line needed any more reason to be fired up for this playoff game, Dickerson gave a speech for the ages, when afterwards, you knew they were not going to lose. It was straight out of a movie script. As Dickerson said recounting the speech, "Remember when you were 8 years old and you went out on the back porch and a bully was standing in the grass and he told you to come down because he wanted to kick your butt? You knew that if you went down there off that porch, then by God, you had better answer the bell." Dickerson added, "The last time we played, Howard Mudd and his boys just walked in and kicked the living you-know-what out of us. Baby, it was time to get down in the backyard with them. They flat slapped us silly last time. We have to answer the bell. We have to stand up like men." And the speech worked. Buffalo's defensive line dominated, as the Chiefs were held to just 77 rushing yards on 3.2 yards per carry. Harvey Williams, who had 103 yards in the first meeting, had just 24 here. And the Bills won convincingly, taking it by a final score of 37-14 to advance to the AFC Championship for the second straight season. That's just who Chuck Dickerson was. He was loud, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind to motivate his players. He loved football. He was excited all the time, and he was just naturally charismatic. You know those people that are just born with that gift of being able to command a room the moment they open their mouth and you hear them speak? That was Dickerson. As Dickerson said back in 1980, when he was coaching at Eastern Illinois more than a decade before this, "I'd never used a microphone in my life. I've been the same all my life. I can't talk about it without getting excited." And on top of just being a naturally charismatic person, he was a heck of a defensive line coach too. The defensive line of the Bills was a huge reason why Buffalo made it to Super Bowl XXVI, making it to their second straight Super Bowl. This was a defensive line that in the AFC Championship recorded 4 sacks on the Broncos and held Denver to 2.5 yards per carry. This was a defensive line that the year before in 1990 finished inside the top 10 in the NFL in sacks, thanks in part to the best year of Bruce Smith's career, as he had 19 sacks and was named the Defensive Player of the Year, even receiving some votes for MVP in the process. A lot of improvement from Smith, especially against the run, came from the coaching of Dickerson. But while making it to the Super Bowl was nice and all, winning it was the next step, which is something that haunted Buffalo ever since they lost the previous Super Bowl by 1 point to the New York Giants. Now, Buffalo has had some tough tests all season, especially if you ask Dickerson. As Dickerson said before the AFC Championship against Denver, in a praiseworthy moment, "We have our hands full with John Elway. We're scared to death. He does some awesome things." But this was going to be their toughest test of them all, because Washington was a completely different beast. Many will argue that in 1991, Washington was one of the greatest teams in NFL history, and is to this day one of the most underrated teams of all time. Personally, I would be inclined to agree. If you replace the name Mark Rippon with Steve Young or Joe Montana, but the stats are exactly the same and are identical, I think we're looking at this team in the eyes of the public as one of the top 3 Super Bowl champions in the history of the sport. And while there were many reasons for the success of Washington throughout the 1991 season, from the great coaching of Joe Gibbs, to an exceptional offense that finished first in points scored, to an exceptional defense that finished second in points allowed, only behind the New Orleans Saints, perhaps the biggest reason was because of the Hogs, one of the greatest offensive line units ever assembled. In fact, it was so good that on the season, including the playoffs, Washington attempted 502 passes, and on those pass attempts, they were sacked 9 times. That's it. 9 sacks allowed on 502 passing plays, or 1.7% of the time. Let's just put that number into perspective. This chart right here shows the number of sacks each team took all season. At the very top, you have the New England Patriots, who took 63 sacks. At the very bottom, you have the New Orleans Saints, who took 19 sacks. And then, let's add Washington to the mix. 9 sacks, not even half of what the Saints had. For some perspective, here's a Week 3 game from earlier that season between 2 other NFC East teams, the Philadelphia Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys, which the Eagles won convincingly, taking it 24-0. The Cowboys allowed more sacks in this game alone than Washington allowed the entire regular season and the entire postseason combined. Seriously, if the Cowboys allowed no sacks other than the ones they allowed in this game, it still would have been more sacks allowed than Washington allowed on the season. And to put that number into even some more perspective, here's a chart showing the percentage of passing plays that a team got sacked on. The league-wide average was somewhere right around 7%. So for every 100 passing plays, you can expect to get sacked on 7 of them. You've got the New England Patriots being the worst with a sack allowed on 11.6% of plays, and the Houston Oilers being the best, with a sack allowed on 3.5% of plays. Only 2 teams are even below 4%, just to give you an idea of how good that is. Now, here's Washington over the course of their first 18 games of that season. 1.7% is absurd. Ridiculously absurd. This was not just the best offensive line in the NFL, but was one of the best offensive lines of all time. You had a first-team All-Pro at left tackle in Jim Lachey, a 3-time Pro Bowler. You had Raleigh McKenzie at left guard, who would go on and play 16 seasons in the NFL. He was the weak link of the line, and he was named a first-team All-Conference member by UPI that season. Again, that was the weakest link. You had Jeff Bostic, a former Pro Bowler who had made 135 starts by this point and had shown no signs of slowing down at center. You had Mark Schlereth, a Pro Bowler, at right guard. And you had Joe Jacoby, a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time first-team All-Pro, and a member of the All-1980s team at right tackle. This offensive line was as close to perfection as possible. If there's an offensive line that compares to the Hogs, it means that it's in the company of one of the greatest offensive lines ever assembled. This was Buffalo's challenge at Super Bowl XXVI. This was the challenge that defensive line coach Chuck Dickerson was dealing with. Find any way, to do what no other team could do and win the battle on the line with the Hogs. And to be fair to Dickerson, he seemed like he laid out the formula perfectly when he talked about planning for Denver's defensive line in the AFC Championship a few weeks before, saying, "It's a matter of using your brains." Well, wherever Chuck Dickerson's brain was leading up to Super Bowl XXVI, it definitely wasn't anywhere in Minneapolis. Heck, it might not have even been in North America. Because in the build-up to the Super Bowl, for some inexplicable reason, Dickerson decided that it would be a good idea to publicly trash talk arguably the greatest offensive line in NFL history. Seriously. As if you need to give them any more motivation, and as if you need to embarrass your team and create an unnecessary distraction before the game, you go ahead and do this. And I don't mean something like saying, "I feel like our defensive line can beat or match up against anyone," or "I'll take Bruce Smith against any offensive lineman in football." I mean full-on trash talk to the point of absurdity. Now, Dickerson was sort of a media favorite at the Super Bowl for his outlandish quotes and for his personality and attitude. During media day, he said on the Super Bowl Experience that it was great because he got a free breakfast and all the toilet paper he could need. He said on his time with the Bills so far that he loved it and said, "I love them more every time I look at my check and see Ralph Wilson's signature on it." On the Super Bowl itself, he said, "I'm not much of a fan. I'd be walleye fishing. That'd be more fun to me. I wouldn't want to sit up in the stands with a bunch of idiots screaming and jumping up and down, spilling beer down my back. I don't know how my wife stands that. Pay $10 to park your car in sub-zero weather and walk 6 miles to watch a football game? You've got to be kidding me." And on rushing the passer, he said, completely unprompted, "I don't care if you like boys, girls, or if you're for gay rights. Just go get the passer." And then on the Hogs, well, what didn't he say? Honestly, he said just about everything. None of it was very smart. On Jim Lachey, he said, "The thing I've noticed about Lachey more than anything else is that he's got bad breath. I've watched him breathe on guys, and they fall down. So he's got to have bad breath. He puts his hands on guys, and they fall down. So somewhere along the line, he's developed a bad breath technique. The key for us is to wear face masks so you don't get that bad breath on your face. You want to get it on your hairline." Saying on Joe Jacoby, even though this paper mistakenly said Lachey for some reason, he's a Neanderthal, always slobbering out there. He probably cusses a lot in the locker room and goes around kicking dogs. On Jeff Bostic, he said, "He's big and ugly like the rest of them. He's somewhere eating grease right now." Combine that with an additional comment on Lachey, where he ought to wear a tutu under his uniform, And combine that with another comment on the line as a whole, where he said, not only do they have 5 fat, ugly guys in front, but they keep 2 or 3 other fat, ugly guys in to help out, and holy cow, Dickerson had just gone completely off the rails. I know he was trying to make some jokes, but let's insult the entire offensive line. Absolutely brilliant move. There's no possible way that this can backfire, and there's no possible way that Washington can use this as motivation whatsoever. And yeah, as you can tell from the highlights, this game was not even close, as Washington completely and utterly dominated this game from start to finish, taking it by a final score of 37-24. Washington scored the first 24 points of the game, and led 37-10 late in the fourth quarter, before 2 garbage time touchdowns to make the score look somewhat respectable, even though the game was anything but that. Oh, and sure enough, Mark Rippon did not get sacked once, as the Hogs, once again, did their job. And after winning the Super Bowl, you can imagine that Washington had quite a few things to say about Dickerson and his ridiculous comments that he made to the media, especially since Washington knew all about them, since head coach Joe Gibbs played the clips to the team on Saturday night before the game. Said Joe Jacoby, "The majority of us have been to quite a few Pro Bowls. Jeff Bostic and myself have been to 4 Super Bowls. This guy was criticizing an offensive line that gave up 9 sacks this year. We had a pretty good rushing attack this year. It kind of makes you upset. You wonder what he's looking at to make those kinds of comments. I think it fired everyone up." Said Mark Schlereth, "I can live with somebody calling me names, but when they talk about guys who have been around here so long and played so well for so long, that made me mad. Maybe they didn't respect us, but they should now." Said defensive end Charles Mann, "He was saying all these things, and he never had to set foot on the football field. Our coaches would never say anything to encourage the other team, especially when they don't have to go out there and play. They don't have to strap on a helmet and hit people." Said Jeff Bostic, "He made a lot of really embarrassing comments, coming from a coach. I wonder if he likes us now." Bostic even said that Dickerson gave the team a great motivational speech. As said Washington quarterback Mark Rippon on the comments, "I think the guys up front were a little extra charged." Before I go any further, I have to bring up this college football game from nearly a decade before. On September 14th, 1983, the Nebraska Cornhuskers traveled up north to Minnesota to take on the Golden Gophers. During this game, the number 1 ranked Cornhuskers not only won, but they basically took Minnesota to the cleaners, taking the game by a final score of 84-13. No, I did not misspeak. 84-13. The game was so bad that Nebraska head coach Tom Osborne apologized afterwards for scoring that many points. The average scoring drive for the Cornhuskers was 68 seconds, and they scored 12 touchdowns. I bring this game up because prior to Super Bowl XXVI, that was the last time that Chuck Dickerson stepped foot in the Metrodome, seeing as he was on Minnesota's coaching staff that year, and was a part of that defensive staff that allowed 84 points. He said that the game was so bad that he was disappointed that the sun came up afterwards the next day. And yet, somehow, allowing 84 points and wishing that you were dead was not the lowest moment of his career in the Metrodome. You would think it would be impossible to go any lower. But you'd be wrong. Oh man, would you be wrong. Because thanks to Chuck Dickerson's absolutely idiotic comments, we found a way to go lower. This was the new low point. This was the new rock bottom. Because 3 days after the game, Dickerson was fired.
Bills got crushed in Super Bowl XXVI. Marv Levy fired his defensive line coach, Chuck Dickerson. The assistant was known as a loudmouth.
Dickerson said that he was kidding about all the comments, and refused to believe that Washington used those remarks as extra motivation, saying, "Those guys are football players. They've been listening to big fat coaches all their lives. They know good and well that was all tongue-in-cheek. They were prepared to play football long before Chuck Dickerson was in their life." so I don't worry much about that. But the Bills thought otherwise. Even though Marv Levy knew that Dickerson was kidding, Levy said after the game on his team, "I think you're better off being totally bland in your comments." Sometimes, I don't think they realize that a comment they make is interpreted to a greater depth than the depth of thought they gave to the matter before making the comment. They make an off-the-cuff comment and are stunned to see how much attention is paid to it. They're better off just talking football. They haven't all got the message. They need to. This team would be better off if they did. And yeah, you can't exactly keep a coach on after making that comment about your players. That's awfully hypocritical if you did. And while no official reason was given for Dickerson's departure, I think we can all assume the reason loud and clear. Dickerson was never going to get fired. He then does this and proceeds to get fired after the Super Bowl. There's a pretty good line of reasoning as to what happened. Dickerson never coached at any level again and became a radio host in Buffalo, where he devoted his time to bashing Marv Levy and his coaching, never forgiving him for firing him. The two men who once worked together now absolutely despised each other. The Chuck Dickerson saga at Super Bowl XXVI is a well-documented one on the absolute worst thing that any coach can do before a game, which is talk trash, even jokingly, to the opposition to such a ridiculous degree that they use it as motivation and take time away from celebrating their Super Bowl win in order to berate and criticize you for doing that. Chuck Dickerson could have been remembered as a very good defensive line coach who made a couple of Super Bowls and had a great, energetic, and infectious personality about him. Instead, he's remembered today as the clown who's partially responsible for costing the Bills a shot at the World Championship, because the Hogs didn't take too kindly to Dickerson hogging the mic. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.